Don Miguelio says, why wasn't evangelism a focus in the Old Covenant? How were Gentiles far away from Israel supposed to learn about Yahweh, and what opportunities for salvation did they have? Well, they had a few. So evangelism was an intended focus for Israel because God says they were supposed to be a light to the world. But the way this light to the world thing happened through Israel was not by people becoming part of Israel, but by them seeing Israel and recognizing that the God of Israel is the true God, putting away their idols and worshiping the God of Israel. But they stayed Gentiles. They didn't become Jewish. An example of this is Naaman, the Syrian, who he comes and he sees Elisha and meets with him. Well, he doesn't even meet with him, actually meets with his servant, and he's got leprosy. And he's gone everywhere for healing. He hasn't gotten it. And so finally he goes to Elisha and he gets his healing. And long story, very short, he gets his healing and realizes, oh, wow, the God of Israel is the true God. And he decides he will worship the God of Israel. I think he went away saved, even though he never became Jewish. He still went back to his town. He didn't become Jewish, but he was worshiping the God of Israel, putting away his idolatry. So I think that was the conversion of a Gentile in the ancient times. And Israel was supposed to stand as a beacon of God's blessings, showing the true God, that God is the true God. Israel didn't do that so good because it involved them walking in obedience to God so that they could be a light. So how else did God do these things? Well, the creation declares the glory of God. Even apart from Israel, God is testifying to the world that he exists, who he is. Romans 1 talks about this, Psalm 19, that men are without excuse because through the very things they see around them, God's nature is perceived. That there's a God who designed that. There's a God who made that. And there's moral awareness in my heart because God is morally good. And so you're aware of God's existence naturally. Now this can be altered and you can lose this and you can have a depraved mind and all this sort of thing. But what I'm suggesting is that there's a type of evangelism that all of creation has been doing for people. An example of this would be a friend of mine who was in the Navy. He was into Native American religious stuff, right? So the Nez Perce tribe up in Canada was, I think, the one that he identified with, right? And he was very much into this Native American religious perspectives. And that was kind of his religion. It was strange. And so he had heard some of this Christian stuff, but what actually radically changed his life is he was in the Navy and he went out onto the deck of the ship and he was on watch one night. And there, with like no light except the stars, he looked up and he saw the stars and he just went, there's a God. And it was like he just knew all that Nez Perce like religious stuff was wrong. And there's just the God who made all this. And he bowed his life to Christ at that moment. And it was clumsy and it was probably incomplete as far as his theology and all that, of course. But what I'm suggesting is that creation is declaring the glory of God. There's people who've been saved because they went on a walk. And out there they saw creation and creation was evangelizing them. Now, is that the entirety of the gospel? No, but I think that God will meet people with the partial knowledge they have. And I have a video on that too. I'll link it below afterwards. It's about what about those who've never heard the gospel. So I'm suggesting Israel was a light without having to turn people into Jews, and that God has been shining light through other things as well. Both internally, our moral awareness, and externally, the creation declaring God's glory.